Welcome back. So, we've talked a lot about coaches on this channel over the last few months, which ones might be on the hot seat. We've also talked about the instability of the head coaching position. So these are all the coaches that were brand new at the start of this season. Yeah, this is a lot of guys. This might be part of the reason why we haven't seen firings yet, because there's so many that are still new to the job. And there are others that teams may not have an option that looks better than what they have behind the bench right now. So I think that's part of why we haven't seen some of the changes that we otherwise normally would during the regular season. So what I've done is I've listed the coaches by where the teams are in the standings. So Boston's at the top, Chicago's at the bottom, everybody else in between. And I wanted to take a look at where the teams are at this season compared to last season and just have a little discussion. You guys can feel free to jump in beneath in the comments there and let me know your thoughts on how each coach has performed. And it's interesting because when a team does well, if you don't like the coach, your answer is they'd be winning no matter who was behind the bench. When a team isn't doing well, it is immediately that coach's fault, though. So that's one of my favorite arguments in hockey is, well, we're on a 10-game winning streak, but anybody could coach this team. And then they lose 3 in a row. See, I told you the coach sucks. They need to fire him. All right, so they don't. Okay, all right, it's cool. So you win despite your coach, but when you lose, it's your coach's fault. That's fantastic. That's got to be great. So Jim Montgomery's at the top of the board. Now, when Boston made the coaching change, there was a lot, including myself, who just didn't agree. And I didn't agree because I thought Bruce Cassidy did a fantastic job. Now, I understand since then there's been a lot that's come to light about whether or not there was a split in that locker room. Well, whatever Jim Montgomery's been doing is working. Right now, they have a record through 33 games of 20, 11. Right now they have a record of 27, 4, and 2 in 33 games, which is 56 points. Last year they had a record of 20, 11, and 2. So last year was a 20, 11, and 2, 42 points. They did make the playoffs. Asterisk means they made the playoffs. And so they're 14 points ahead of last year's pace, where they made the playoffs anyways. So for Boston, they're just absolutely cruising. They're currently 23 games above 500. Yeah, that's ridiculous. That means that if they play 500 from here, they end up with 105 points. Last I checked, 105 points is a pretty darn good season as it is. Now, Bruce Cassidy right there underneath with Vegas. Now, Vegas is a team that when they made the change behind the bench, there was some discussion because last year's Vegas team got hit with a lot of injuries. So the difference between where they are right now and where they were last season, it's not a huge difference. Last year, they were 22-13-1 for 45 points. They would end up 3 points out of the playoffs at the end of the season. This year, 24-11-1, 49 points through 36 games, so they've improved by 4 points from where they were last year. They currently reside at first in the Pacific Division. And really, it is their division to lose. Like, at this point, there isn't a team in that division that I think really challenges them. And Bruce Cassidy, I think, has done a very good job behind the bench. So it's only a 4-point difference, but it is in the positive. And yeah, Vegas has done this without Leonard and without some other big players too that they lost in the offseason. Pete DeBoer gets into Dallas, takes over from Rick Bowness. Bowness decides he's leaving. Through 35 games last year, Dallas was 18-15-2 for 38 points. They would end up making the playoffs last year. They had a really solid second half of the season. This year, they've had a really solid first half. They're 29-6 through 35 games for 46 points, an improvement of 8 points over where they were at this point last season. And DeBoer is doing what I thought he would, and that is improving the offense from Dallas. I do still have some concerns on certain nights, but yeah, their offense has been good, and so here's to hoping it stays that way. Because again, as a Dallas fan, I've seen this where there's the feast or famine portions of your program, and they've had the feasts very often, usually followed by some pretty big famines. So we'll see how long this goes and how far they go with this. But right now, they look like a really good bet to make the playoffs, as do the Jets, who hired Bowness. And of course, Bowness was seen as kind of not necessarily a consolation prize for not getting Barry Trotz, but come on, at the time that Bowness got hired, there were some that thought, hey, he's probably just a placeholder till Trotz comes in. But all indications right now are that Trotz may very well end up going somewhere else if he decides to coach again. But Bowness has done a good job. So last year, they were 17-12-5 for 39 points at this point in the season. They would end up 8 points out of the playoffs at the end of the year. This year, they're 21-12-1, which is a 43-point total so far. They are 4 points ahead of last year's pace. So as long as they can avoid any kind of drop-off in the second half of the season, they shouldn't have a problem ending up with, I think 95 points probably gets you in the playoffs in the West. I don't see any reason why Winnipeg can't at least get 95 points. For the Islanders, Lane Lambert, of course, coming in under some controversy in that they fired Barry Trotz. Trotz was not seen as the problem last year. Scheduling, shutdowns, injuries, illness, everything you can imagine hit the New York Islanders last year. Through 35 games last season, they were 15, 14, and 6 for 36 points. They ended up finishing 16 points out of the playoffs. They just couldn't recover from that 13-game road trip. And then the homestand that followed, which was an absolute disaster. This year, they're 19, 14, and 2, 40 points through 35 games. They are 4 points ahead of where they were last year. They are 2 points out of the playoffs, but they have a game in hand on Washington. So, yes, they're 2 points behind Washington. They're not in the playoffs, but they're right there. And Lane Lambert's done a good job. I think the Islanders are more watchable this year than last year. I think they're more entertaining, is what I'm saying. And I think some of that's to do with Lambert. It's not exactly the same as it was under Trotz. It does feel like they're playing a little bit of a different style, and it's been working so far. Derek Lalonde. Now, I've heard Lalonde. I said Lalonde, but it is Lalonde. That's how he wants it pronounced. Which is, of course, since he's had the nickname Newsy at points during his lifetime, because Newsy Lalonde, ancient NHL history with that reach back. But at any rate, Lalonde has really helped Detroit so far this year, even though the points are not that much different from last year. Last year at this time, they were 15, 14, and 3 for 33 points. This year, they're 14, 11, and 7 for 35 points. Last year, they were 26 points out of the playoffs. They're 2 points ahead of last year's pace, but they're currently 7 points behind the Washington Capitals. They do have 4 games in hand on the Washington Capitals, but they need to win all 3, or all 4, I should say. And so, yeah, my brain might be on the Christmas break, so I'm going to apologize for any misspeaking that goes on. But there are people who like to see the daily videos, and why should they stop just because it's Christmas Eve? So Derek Lalonde, I think, has done a good job. I know that the wins are not what they were expected to be maybe with the start they had, and they've had a rough patch. But that's going to happen. I still believe in the Yzer plan, and here we are. Then you get to the biggest surprise on the board, which is Florida. Paul Maurice. I wanted to do a video on Florida because I am absolutely shocked at the difference between the team that finished those playoffs and the team that started this season. This team does not resemble that one at all, and the points back it up. Last year, at this time, through 35 games, 23, 7, and 5, 51 points. Made the playoffs, won the President's Trophy. Now, I understand pacing yourself, and I understand that the President's Trophy, usually you don't win if you win the Cup if you get the President's Trophy, so pace yourself a bit. But Florida needs to pick up the pace. They're 15, 16, and 4. They've won 15 out of 35 games. This is insane. Absolutely insane. 34 points puts them 17 points off of last year. So as much as I can argue Jim Montgomery has helped Boston, I cannot say that Paul Maurice behind the bench hasn't had a negative impact on the Florida Panthers. Brunette may not have got them over the hump in the playoffs. Sure. I agree. And the style of hockey they were playing, it needed to change. But they're currently 8 points out of the playoffs with only 1 game in hand on Washington. So I understand it's early in the season. I understand they still have 47 games left to play, but they have to win a lot of those 47 games. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, 30? Do they have to win 30 of those final 47 games? 30 wins, and you sprinkle in some overtime losses, you might be able to get to about 100 points. So they can only afford to lose maybe... They've lost 16 in regulation to this point. They can afford to lose maybe 14 more in regulation if they want to make the playoffs, is my estimation, right? So, not great. And honestly, for Florida, if things continue to trend in this direction, I don't see how Maurice would stay beyond 1 year. Unless Florida decides to completely change the makeup of their team. But it's an interesting one, and I mentioned this in last night's recap. And there's definitely a video there to be made maybe over the next few days where there's no hockey on. Florida, Calgary, Columbus, all intertwined in storylines over the summer. All 3 of them with mostly underwhelming returns, although Calgary has gotten above the playoff line with 7 points out of a possible 8 in their trip through California. So Maurice, it's been remarkable to see the difference. Florida was the team that in the third period they'd fight back and they'd get it. Now, the loss of Huberdeau, the loss of Weegar, I think those can't be overstated. But this is not the same team. It's not the same team. So it's worthy of another look, but I want to look at it through the lens of Florida, Calgary, Columbus, and where things have gone wrong. Which brings us to Philadelphia, the land of where things have gone wrong, at least on the ice in hockey, not with football. So John Tortorella honestly wanted to make this team better. The numbers have actually gotten worse from last season. I was surprised to see this. 35 games last year, 13, 15, and 7 record for 33 points. They finished 39 points out of the playoffs. This year, they're 11, 17, and 7 for 29 points. They've lost 4 points. They're currently 13 points outside of the playoffs. Again, I don't think this is an on-purpose thing because they brought Tortorella, and Tortorella said all the right things about making the playoffs. So it felt like Philadelphia was trying this year. Not, we're going to trade our first-round draft pick kind of trying, but yeah, it's odd to see that the numbers have actually dropped off this year with Tortorella behind the bench, especially considering the start they had wasn't bad, but it's been an absolute disaster since then. San Jose, kind of a similar story here, but we all remember San Jose got off to a good start. Last year they were 18, 16, and 1 at this point, 37 points altogether. They ended up finishing 20 points out of the playoffs, so they fell off, and they fell off badly. This year they're 11, 18, and 6, 28 points, which is 9 points off last year's pace. They're 11 points out of the playoffs. Before this season, we heard that management, ownership had no interest in a rebuild. Sometimes it doesn't matter if you have an interest in a rebuild. And I always found that interesting when a team is outside the playoffs by that much. And you'll see, well, we're just going to try to bounce back. When you know that the young talent they need to make that bounce back isn't necessarily there. For San Jose, there's a couple of guys on the way. I'm looking at Bortolo, I'm looking at Eklund. But I don't see anything that saves them this year. And I don't blame David Quinn for this at all. I really don't. He just does not have a roster that's good enough. It's like Tortorella. He does not have what he needs to win. That's why we're seeing him benching guys out of frustration, healthy scratches that are head scratchers themselves because you're doing everything you can to try to win. Then you get to Luke Richardson. Ownership said we're trying to rebuild, and Richardson wanted to make that difficult for them. And early in the season, he did pretty well, but lately it's gotten worse. So last year at this time, they were 11, 17, and 4 for 26 points. They ended up 29 points out of the playoffs last year. Rough season. This year it's gotten rougher. 8, 20, and 4. They have 20 points. That's a drop of 6 points. They're currently 19 points out of the playoffs. So yeah, it's overall been a disaster for Chicago, and of course the big question mark is where does Kane go, where does Taves go, and what do they get back for them? So it's not just a matter of trading them either, it's what do you get back, and if you don't get back enough, you're going to hear it from Chicago fans for a while. So it is interesting to look at how these coaches have done, which ones you can blame, which ones you can't, which ones you can credit, which ones you don't, because with hockey fans and with sports fans in general, that's always the discussion, right? But whether or not a coach deserves that recognition for a team turning around. Does a coach deserve the blame when the team turns in the wrong direction? Is it really the coach's fault? And so, yeah, there's a lot to be said. And how many of these coaches survive after this season is also a question mark. I would say there's the possibility that John Tortorella has a one and done like he did in Vancouver. But I think for Tortorella, that might be if he decides this hasn't been fun this year and he decides not to come back. I don't think Philadelphia would fire him after this season unless somebody else was coming in that they wanted more. Florida, I do have questions about whether or not Florida would have the patience for another year under Maurice if this team misses the playoffs. And I think that's an interesting question to be asked. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.